Hi, I'm Caleb, and today I'll be showing you how to make a 3D basket weave style cutting board. Also, make sure you stick around towards the end of the video to see how I fixed a couple critical mistakes during the build. The first thing I did was join some offcuts of maple, cherry, and walnut from past projects to use in the first glue up. There will be 3 different glue ups before the final one. Here I'm resawing my boards to a little over ½ inch since they will be planed down to that later. I could have just planed all of this away, but resawing it helps me to not be as wasteful. Then I took the boards over to the planer and planed them down to exactly ½ inch thick. Next I ripped my maple boards at ½ inch, giving me ½ inch by ½ inch strips. The walnut and cherry boards were then ripped to 1 inch. Then I set my blade to a 45-degree angle with the distance of ½ inch from the fence to the base of the blade and cut that angle onto the walnut and cherry pieces. Looking back, to cut down on possible error, I should have done this while the fence was still set for the ½ inch maple strips. Now we can glue up one of the first sections. First, I taped the angled edges of the walnut and cherry boards like shown to act kind of like a hinge and help keep the seams tight during the glue up. Once all the pieces were in place, I ran some tape around the boards to help keep them in place while applying the clamps. It's important you apply clamps from both directions to minimize gaps in the glue up. I then went ahead and repeated the process on the other sections. I needed around 68 inches in length of this glue up. While those were drying, I began working on milling up some of the wood for the next 2 glue ups needed. Here I'm resawing the maple a little over ½ inch just like before, but the walnut boards were done at a little over an 1/8 inch as well as a 1/16 inch. Then the maple got planed down to ½ inch. Next I cut one of the walnut pieces into strips a little wider than 1 inch. This was followed by drum sanding some of the walnut to 1/8 of an inch and the other ones to a 1/16. Here you can see how the pieces will get glued together. I start with one of the 1/16 inch walnut strips, followed by a ½ inch maple and then an 1/8 inch walnut, followed by another maple and finishing off with a 1/16 inch walnut. Also, I think I forgot to mention earlier, but these pieces are around 3½ inches wide in order to allow some dimensioning after gluing up. You'll want around 48 inches in length of this pattern. Then the same thing was done but with the narrower strips. You'll only need 22 inches in length of this one. Once dry, I cleaned up one edge of both sandwiches and sanded the narrow one to exactly 1 inch in thickness, and lightly touched up the first pieces we glued up, sanding them to exactly 1 inch as well. Now before ripping down the larger sandwich, I want to talk about the importance of relative measuring. According to my plans, I should rip it at 3¼ inches. However, What actually matters isn't the dimension, but that it matches the width of these 3 pieces put together. By taking my measurements from the pieces it would get glued to, I can ensure everything fits together with minimal or no gaps during the final glue up. And I did end up having to rip it just a fraction smaller than my plans originally called for. Here I'm just double checking my pieces were lining up, and thankfully it was spot on. And then using my miter gauge, I cut all the pattern pieces at 1.5 inches. With all the pieces cut, I laid them out according to the model I created and began to realize just how fun this glue up was going to be with so many pieces. Using a paintbrush, I applied glue to all the surfaces that needed gluing, trying to work as quick as possible so the glue wouldn't start to set up before I was finished. Once everything was in place, I put some masking tape along the boards I was using to clamp so as not to glue them to the actual cutting board. Then I clamped it from both directions and pounded the pieces down to keep it as flat as possible. Once it was dry, I ran it through the drum sander and came to realize a few errors had happened while rushing that glue up. As you can see, somehow in the process, these 3 pieces got flipped and weren't in the correct orientation. I debated leaving them, but decided it'd be worth it to try and fix them. For the corner, I'm going to try and cut it off and replace it with this extra piece. And for the 2 inner ones, I'll inlay some offcuts. So with the plan in mind, I routed out the bulk of the material and then very carefully chiseled the remaining bit. I then put a small bevel on the edges of the piece I was inlaying to help it slide in better. After a little test fit and almost getting it completely stuck, I glued it in place and did the other one as well. While these were drying, I cut off the corner with the wrong orientation at the bandsaw, staying back from the line so I could sneak up on it with the chisel again. Once satisfied, I glued the corner back on the board and inlaid the 2 pieces on the other side of the board as well. Then I trimmed off the excess and ran it through the drum sander one more time. And as you can see, the fix thankfully turned out great and you can't tell there was ever anything wrong. With both surfaces flattened, I trimmed the sides and ends flush and sanded the board with my orbital and gave all the edges a 1/8 inch round over, followed by a little more sanding. Lastly comes my favorite part, where I can finish off the board with mineral oil. And here is how it came out. As always, if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments, let me know down below and I'll do my best to get back. Thanks for watching.